Right, so after a lot of mess and frustration because nothing technologically was working for me just then, we are finally going to crack on with book club. So I will introduce Joseph. Joseph, welcome. I say welcome. We're doing your podcast, aren't we?
It's partially mine, partially yours.
Yeah.
It seems to be a shared thing.
I think so.
But,
we're finally doing Joan of Arc. We're just going to do the first few chapters.
This book is, well, as said in our previous episode, it's a great novel. It's a classic for a reason. And I don't know, and yet I find it funny that it's so hard to find in most places here in North America, at least.
I struggled to get it. I had to order it.
Okay. Well, I just know that in large parts of North America, like everybody goes, oh, there's Mark Twain's classics, but don't read Joan of Arc.
Yeah.
And yet I find that this is his best work.
Yeah, very much. It's very good.
Yeah, but you had a lot that you wanted to say regarding the way he writes it with Joan and whatnot.
Yeah, I think you probably look at it from a slightly different angle, but I found myself looking at certain styles that he wrote with, and not just styles, but he really delves it. Like, he has researched every single Bible passage that surrounds anything he writes. I found myself just scribbling down different scriptures that connected it to it. I found it fascinating. Whereas, what angle are you going to be taking it from?
Well, mostly I've been taking note of the actual events.
Yeah.
Looking at the history and making the comparison, but also at, of course, archetypes like Dan and I always read it. But on the other hand, once you pointed out the Bible passage stuff, I did start to notice that more and more, so that I can't kind of I can't look at it without thinking of that as well. So it's certainly something that I'm like, oh yeah. And of course, I'm also looking at it from the point of view that this is a 19th century novel, so the narrator has to be studied and psychoanalyzed to an extent, as though he were a real person, so that you have to kind of mistrust the narrator, but not in a way that I'll say, like, I'll get out of the way. Le Sieur Louis de Comte, or the Louis of the story, because Comte means story, but it's not that he's not misleading the reader to an extent. He seems like a character who's telling the truth, but there's only one point when he lies in the story I noticed, because the point where I've reached, he's claiming, oh, I'm in love with this one girl, Catherine Boucher. But then he's like, oh, but Joan's eyes were so wonderful, and I'm like, dude, who you fooling?
Yeah.
You're not in love with Catherine, you're in love with Joan, admit it.
And he also mentions, what's the name of the character? The pompous character, the one that's full of
Paladin.
himself.
I love Paladin.
The Paladin. And he talks about the Paladin being in love as well. And I feel like there's just an element of jealousy in the writing. There's a prickliness to it. But my first point early on,
but
this
I
is.
was going to say
go
same
on.
time.
Yeah, go on.
There's a love Louis feels for, like, Paladin.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like him, Noel, and Paladin all seem like they're best friends and brothers. So that when you're reading it, I find that you can see that Louis, as he's recounting the story, looking back, you could almost see him almost gulping a few times because, like, he lost all his friends in war. So you're kind of looking at it from that point of view, I think, where you have to look at it like he's a war veteran in a way. So I find that I psychoanalyze him and I look at him like, okay, why are you telling me this? Or what are you getting at by saying this is what happened? Or like he gets prickly about Paladin and he's like, well, Paladin did this and I don't like that. But on the other hand, there are times when, like, he's almost trying to sell Paladin to us
Yeah.
as a certain, like, Paladin deep down has a chicken-hearted side, but he's trying to go, well, don't look at that. Paladin's, like, he does have a great side. He wasn't that chicken-hearted, but he was. But it's like,
there's an affection. There's an affection.
Yeah.
It's inborn and natural.
But Louis is not a lying narrator by nature. He's a truthful one, but you can see Twain does a great job showing the pain of an old man as he's recounting the story. So I also find that's hard not to look at. But the Bible verses, the minute you mentioned that, I started going, wait, what? I never noticed that. Then I started reading it and I went, oh my gosh, it's in every passage, for heaven's sake.
Every single one. I've written so many scriptures down where I go, oh, that's just like this moment in the Bible, and it's just like that moment in the Bible. But before I get into that, right early on, there's just something I wanted to point out. There's something that Twain does that vexes me when I see it from any normal writer. But when you see Twain do it, he's doing it with a brilliance, a mastery. And just before he does the L'Arbre Fille de Boulemont song, and this is a prime example, and I've mentioned it quite a few times in my book, but he does something where he uses a word repetitively, and he uses it to dance. So when someone uses the same word repetitively, it annoys me when they're writing. But he does it all the time. So in the paragraph before that, he says, so always from the remotest times when the children joined hands and danced around the fairy tree, they sang a song, which was the tree's song, the song of L'Arbre Fille de Boulemont. They sang it with sweet air, but he uses that word song 3 times and it almost bounces. He's almost using it poetically.
He uses tree like 2-3 times as well, and it's like, stop. Any other writer, you're going, stop using that word, but with him, it's like he's weaving a spell.
Yep. And so we're leading to this poem, and he kind of has these little bouncing moments in it where he goes, he says, I was weary and troubled, resting me and carrying me through night and distant home again. There's that ding, 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 ding. It's like a bounce to the words. And a bit further down the paragraph, he says, and you will understand how the water wells up in our eyes and makes all things dim. Our voices break and we cannot sing the last lines. And that's bounce. There's poetry before the poem. And I loved that. I thought, wow, what a powerful way to write. What a powerful way. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't like seeing the repetition of the same words, because I'm someone who, when I'm writing, I sometimes use the same word, but then I go back and I go synonyms, and I look up synonyms and I change the wording around and I use different synonyms, and I look for other writers to do that, because, well, you look at all the greats like Victor Hugo, Tolkien, all of them use synonyms. Synonyms are their bread and butter. But Twain, he does know how to do that. He does that sometimes, but then he'll reuse the same word over and over again. But there's a spell that he kind of casts with it. I don't know how else to describe it. There's almost something to the Irish or Scottish belief system from, that there's magic in words. Yeah. And that he's using that to weave and kind of enchant you and whatnot.
He literally does it on the next page from my book, but I think we've got, because mine's about 270, whereas yours is 500. But he says, there's a paragraph, but he says, but her mind was wandering. She did not know what she said, nor what we meant. So we went away knowing all was lost. Yes, all was lost. Forever lost. And I was like, no other writer does that I can think of. I can't think of another writer that writes that way. Can you?
No, I don't think so. And no. I'm trying to think of one. Yeah. And the closest I could come up with is Ken Follett sometimes reuses the odd word in here and there, but his prose counterpoint is not very strong. His strength is in storytelling, but not in the actual counterpoint, so to speak. Yeah. But Mark Twain is someone with a strong counterpoint, but yeah, he does do some weird stuff with the text. And he's a very peculiar writer.
He is. But I like him a lot.
I know he's repeating that, but he's very peculiar. And what's more is, like, you look at just the fairy tree, the very idea of the fairy tree, it's something that, like, in terms of, like, as a kid, I would have said, yes, that's very French. C'est très français, ça. But then, as a grown man, at one point, I would have said that's more Irish or Scottish. But there's a, like, there's an awareness that, there's of that Celtic side of French culture. And he's slipping it in under the surface.
100%.
And, like, it's such a peculiar thing. And I mean, no offense, but if you were to show, like, English children dancing around a tree like that, I would kind of cast a bit more doubt, because I'd be like, no, English kids are going to race off into the fields. They're not going to dance around a tree. Obsessing about a tree or something, or a multitude of trees, is more Celtic. That's a Scottish or Irish thing. But the English, like, you look at his Huckleberry Finn characters and whatnot, they're all going to race off, and they're in the fields, in the muck and the mire. So there's an awareness of the psychological differences in these two different kinds of societies. So he also manages to cast an image of, the difference between the French children and, let's say, the English right there. And he just does things like that just to show the differences. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And so in that chapter 2, The Fairy Tree of Don Remy, he does that, and it does take you to a very non-English place. It takes you to a more, perhaps, a more thoughtful culture, or a more connected culture.
Celtic.
Yeah, very much so. And there's a paragraph, like, for me, it's like the second page of that chapter. It's sort of halfway between the start and the poem. And he's referencing a lot of things all at the same time. But there's this moment in it that, to me, was pure poetry. And he says, and then the vision fades and passes, but they know. They know. And by their transfigured faces, you know also. You who stand looking on. Yes, you know the message that has come, and that it has come from heaven. And the way he writes that is just poetic. It's just perfect. And he's referencing here a number of things, but definitely Acts 7:51, where he's talking about Stephen the martyr, because it's similar. The vision is similar to when Stephen is being stoned, and he sees the heavens, and he sees the Lord in heavens. Very, very... There's a lot of connection there. He's writing on all different levels. It's amazing.
Okay, I'm not familiar with Stephen the Martyr, but...
So he was considered almost like a Christ-like character after Christ.
Okay.
And he was stoned to death by Paul. Well, Paul never threw a stone. He stood and held the jackets of the men stoning him. And then Paul later became the Apostle Paul. But at the time, he was not a priest, but he was something along those lines. And he stood and watched the stoning of Stephen the martyr. But in that moment, the vision that Stephen sees feels similar to what this paragraph resonates with. And I feel like as he wrote this, he'd studied that and worked out how he wanted to say it. He wrote it as close to a religious text he felt was necessary, I think.
But there's also something that Twain does for Louis here as a character.
Yeah.
Where he says, like, he comments on, if you're full of sin, you'll see the tree being withering.
Yes.
In the winter. But then if you see it in full bloom, you've lived a good life, you're a good man, you're going to heaven and whatnot.
Yeah.
But he says, now the several traditions were, as I have said, some believing one and some another. One of them I know to be the truth, and that was the last one.
Yeah.
Referring to the fact that you're going to see this within about 2 years of your death.
Yeah.
So that he's hinting that Louis is going to die.
Yeah.
And I remember this is something which I have the graphic novel of this novel, because I saw it on sale once and I had to pick it up. And in the graphic novel, it ends with Louis breathing his last under a tree near Domremy, where that author decided to take that kind of artistic license to the character. And I actually like that approach.
Yeah.
Where as soon as he's finished telling the tale, he soon afterwards expires. So there's the thing with Louis is he's on borrowed time. And he admits that essentially right there. So essentially, to an extent, I think this kind of further sells the character in a way as a truth teller in a way, because this is almost the last story he's going to get the chance to tell, because he's probably like an 80-year-old man, and he's going to be recounting he's the last member of Jeanne's team to still be alive. But there's also another thing that's notable. Just to get into a bit of the history, Louis would have lived through the reigns of Charles VII, who I don't know of a single French person who likes Charles, the Dauphin from Jeanne's era. Louis, l'Araignée universelle, or Universelle Araignée, as others call him. L'Araignée, Louis XI was one of France's strongest kings. Although he liked to dip his fingers in other countries' politics just to cause them to go War of the Roses, almost. Like, he caused trouble everywhere he went, just because he did not want any other stable country except for France. And Louis was succeeded by his incompetent son, Charles VIII. So he's, preceded and succeeded by a terrible monarch.
Yes.
And in that regard, you can kind of see, the good times are behind France for a short time, because France is about to get wrapped up in the Italian wars with Spain/Germany, and under Charles VIII. And so, there's a bit of anyone who knows the history of France knows that with Louis's death, around the time of 1492, France is about to head into a tumultuous period for about almost 20 years.
Yeah. Very difficult time. There's a silly movie. I don't know if you've ever watched it, The Brothers Grimm. Oh,
I love that movie.
Yeah, I do. And that's sort of around that period of time where they're at war with both Italy and France. Italy and Germany, sorry. Good fun movie. You should watch it if you haven't seen it. The Brothers Grimm.
I love that movie.
So, because we said we were going to only take sort of half an hour, I thought we could press on with the next section where she's talking to the priest.
That's the story you said last time. That's the story of Jesus and the various priests he impresses as a teenager.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember that story.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
But you know what also I really love is, so there's a section of this that's dialogue, and there's that often that need from authors to fill the dialogue with information, but he doesn't fill it with information at all. You're left to interpret a lot of what's going on, because there's this bit where so it just transitions back and forth. Yes, Father. Did you hang them on the tree? No, Father. Didn't hang them there. No. Why didn't you? I didn't wish to. Didn't wish to. No, Father. What did you do with them? I hung them in the church. Why didn't you want to hang them in the tree? And there's this no fill-in. You just, in your mind, you're playing the game of, how's this being said? And like when he says, didn't wish to, you can picture the priest raising his eyebrow. It doesn't need to say raised eyebrow. You just see the priest going, didn't wish to. And then you see her piously say, I hung them in the church. And all these little things, you're left to play the story out in your head. And I thought that was fantastic.
I always imagine his eyebrows rising further along his forehead as he's just going, what?
and he thinks he's got her. I love it. He's walking her into the trap, and actually she's full of fire and full of her rightness, and I loved that. I thought it was such a good bit of writing. Fantastic.
The trap's actually for him.
Yeah, because he's going into the guilt by association argument, which is a terrible argument.
Yeah, that argument never works.
No. And then literally you go straight into the next bit and he starts doing the 2 and 3 times using words again. And I'm like, wow, he's teasing you with things, pulling it away, teasing you a little bit more, pulling it away. I thought it was fantastic. I loved it.
And what's more is, now in chapter 3, Jeanne has her collection of pets. And whatnot, that she seems to continuously collect. And it reminds me of how the Bible would say, men should have flocks
Yeah,
and whatnot, and
absolutely.
herds and whatnot. But it also reminds me of the fact that where I'm from in Northern Ontario, it was very, very French.
Mm-hmm.
And every family almost competed to have pets, and a number of pets, or just spoiling their pets. And pets would sometimes wander across the street to a different house, just whether it's cats or dogs. They'd try to wander across, just because every family tried to compete with each other to spoil each other's pets and their own. And I know it sounds weird, but it's just, that's an old, at least where I came from, French families were obsessed with dogs, cats, birds, pets. The more you had, the better you were than everyone else, in a way. But it's a very French thing. So her having 30 pets all hanging about her and swiping at her breakfast and lunch.
Well, I
feel like it's Twain poking fun at the French in a way.
Possibly. I saw it a little differently.
But it's also about the sweetness of this girl.
Just to finish that point. In Genesis, very early on, we see God makes man in his image, and it talks about having the animals in subjection, and then that's reiterated in Isaiah 11 that a child, the animals, like a child will be able to play with a cobra, etc., etc., etc. And
oh yeah, I remember that passage.
Yes, and we see here Joan, when she's talking about the animals, that they're not scared of her, and that's one of the things they talk about. Like, the animals won't be scared of humans, and humans won't be scared of animals. And I just think that is almost a godlike character that Twain's imbued into her. Do you know what I mean with that?
Because in the Bible, in Genesis, and I think in the New Testament to an extent with Jesus, it's stated that the most perfect, and even with the story of Daniel, I think in the lion's den, the idea is that the perfect man or woman can live in peace and with animals, and they'll never feel the urge to, eat or kill or what have you, the human being. It's a statement on her godliness.
Yes, and absolutely.
I think that Mark Twain is doing something there, artistically and in terms of literary techniques. But I referenced Daniel and even Adam and Eve, and I don't think Twain is trying to compare her to them, but to, like you've been implying, Jesus. There's a direct comparison he's making, and he's really pushing that angle in, which is something that's hard not to see now that you've pointed it out so much. And it's oh yeah. And even with the the fact that she has their blessings, it's like an angelic force's blessings upon her at an early age. And there's a lot that Twain is stating there. You have the madman who goes nuts in the village, who's a murderer, and she ends up taming him in a way. Feeding him and taking care of him and talking to him and kind of redeeming him. There's also the veteran who's fallen on hard times that she takes in akin to a pet. Yeah. And the thing is, she's basically all but adopting these grown men like they're her pets, but she's doing something which, she's saving their souls. And it reminds me of that passage. Now, like I said, I keep saying I've not read the Bible in 20 years. So my memory is
no.
Of the Bible stories. But I do remember, he is who is without sin cast the first stone. And that seems like what Twain's kind of referencing there, where Jeanne is just you shouldn't judge the murderer too harshly. Or, she's basically implying that, and she's like, well, I want to take in this random stranger into the house or whatnot. And, treating him a bit like the prodigal son. Yeah. And, she's just taking in these guys whom everybody else is going, no, don't. You don't know where they've been. Yeah. But she's redeeming them, and she's trying to save their souls in a way.
It's yeah, you're not wrong. The next section, I think he's playing with the Jacob and Esau story. but he reverses the story almost. So he makes her brother Esau, but then feminizes him because Esau was the manly man. He was the manly brother. He went out and hunted. That's who he was.
Yeah.
And he feminizes
Yeah.
him. But
He was cool.
yeah, but Jacob was in reality a bit of a rascal because he played a trick on his brother to get his inheritance. Yeah, and you see, look, right there in the wording it says, if you don't obey me, rascals are not entitled to help from honest people. And there's this reference to the rascal nature. And I'm like, there's no way this wasn't on purpose.
Yeah, it definitely was.
And then straight after that, we go back to him using the same word repetitively because he uses the word responsibility 6 times in one paragraph.
Yep.
He goes,
I noticed that.
Responsibility means, and how it affects the case in point, responsibility makes a man responsible for only those things for which he is properly responsible. And then a bit further, class of responsibilities which render people responsible. He keeps using, and then again, 2 more times further down the page. 8 times he uses the word responsibilities in one paragraph. Very interesting.
He's playing a game and teasing us.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
He had a sense of humor.
And then
I'm just commenting on.
Just pulling that to the end of this chapter.
I'm also going to
comment
on one thing with Noel.
Go on, please.
The character of Noel, playing Claygasson, he's the rapscallion of the group who's always teasing and poking at Paladin. He reminds me of Twain in personality. Just like, how Twain's just playing this responsible joke. Noel seems like the type who's constantly playing that kind of joke.
So you think he's inserted himself into the novel through Noel?
To a limited extent, yes and no. Like, he's made the character separate from Twain himself, but he's kind of put in his own rapscallion sense of humor in a way. Like this, I'm going to see how often you catch on to me using responsible. And just this kind of practical joke on the reader. I think Noel is kind of supposed to be that Noel has that sense of humor. That Twain gave a bit of himself to that character in that regard.
Very interesting.
Just because the way Noel talks and the way he cracks his jokes, and he seems to lead people to a certain direction, then cracks wordplay jokes on them. Reminds me of the wordplay jokes Twain is basically playing here, as well as Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and whatnot. So Noel really reminds me of the man himself.
Yes.
So that I was a kid, I've just kind of eyed Noel like, why is he in this book? But also kind of looked at him like, he's the joke being played on us.
Yes.
By this writer.
Interesting.
But on the other hand, but I did notice the responsible word being used 8 times. Well, I thought I had counted about 6 times, and
I counted 6, but there's 2 more further down the paragraph.
Yeah, 8 times, like you pointed out, and that I remember just going, he's going to keep doing this, isn't he? And you just, once you look at how he's just going to play these little jokes on you, you can't look away. But if you look at other stories written by Twain, he knows how to use synonyms. It's just, and even in this story, he'll do that. But then occasionally he'll throw in these little practical jokes at you, so to speak, and just constantly repeat the word. Yeah. Just beating it over your head just for fun. And he was essentially a comedy writer, but he knew how to write non-comedy as well.
I think that's where people get stuck with this novel, is he is writing comedically, but subtle. It's like it's just hidden beneath, it's like subtextual, as opposed to outright, like, games. It's subtlety in it.
But he starts with the tone of, he starts with a comedic tone, but as the novel progresses, he gets steadily darker. Yeah. He's more emotional through this. He's very emotional in this. Yes. Yes, that's very true. And which, like, you look at also, like, the different characters are very distinct from each other in such a way. Not every writer can score those kind of key differences. And you look at Noel, like I said, he's a lot like Twain, has that sense of humor and likes to play sly little jokes on people. You have Louis, who's very loyal, quiet, and yet very, very, very dedicated to Jeanne. But he also has a bit of a prickly nature and he has a slight snobbishness to him that comes from being upper class. It's under the surface, a bit of his haughtiness. Yeah. But on the other hand, he seems to genuinely adore peasants, in some ways more than nobility. So that Louis is almost a tragic character. He's caught between his nobility, but he was raised amongst peasants. So he's caught in the middle. Yeah. He doesn't quite belong to either. Yes. But on the other hand, he has a prickly nature, like you pointed out. And you have Jeanne, who's just sheer perfection. But there's something that Twain also does that, like, each of these characters are basically her disciples, in a way.
I've written that down. As Jesus, he's created a disciple and apostle type characters and drawn upon that with each of them, I feel. There's like well, we'll go into it further because we've done our half an hour. So guys, that's just the first 3 chapters. There's lots more and we'll probably condense it a bit further. But like you said, we had half an hour for today. We've gone beyond that. Should we pick this up with chapter 4 next time?
Yes, certainly. There's just so much to get through with these chapters, and he does so much, and this is such a great book. I think next time, so if we pick this up again, next time we can go chapter 4 through to, let's say, we'll 8. Finish, something along those lines, that sounds good. As in of book 1. Yeah, chapter 8 of book 1. We'll finish off book 1. Okay, guys, thank you very much for joining us on this. Look forward to the next time. Enjoy reading it. Tell us in the comments what you think of it. Tell us what you think of it and what you've picked up in the book. Because we think we've probably missed loads between us. There's no doubt. After you, anything else you'd like to add before we leave this? Well, you can follow us both at Storyfire and on YouTube. Yep. I'm going to be posting the video over at my History Corner channel, and over on Storyfire, of course. If you follow on Storyfire, give the Brothers Crin a little tip of Blaze. It goes down a treat. And give him a follow. Give the Brothers Crin a follow on Storyfire. Give him a follow on Twitter, on YouTube. It's important. Yeah, thank you. Helps build this up. Guys, see you next time. Yep. Have fun.